So you've probably guessed it's cold, judging by the head where I've got on today. We're actually in Wales and we're going to do some fishing on the absolutely beautiful Welsh Dee. Now, this winter grayling season, to be honest, has been a complete nightmare. The river's been massive week after week. We're in sort of mid-January now and it's dropped in perfect. The heights are absolutely perfect, and for once we've got some absolutely beautiful winter weather. So these are the kind of conditions that when you see them you really want to get out and make the most of it and try and catch some grayling. We're going to try and probably fish a couple of different methods today, dependent on the kind of water that we look at. But I'll talk you through why I'm using those methods and what makes me pick them and how I like to fish them when I'm just out on a nice, pleasurable winter grayling day. Okay, so what we've done is we've walked about a mile upstream, so I've ditched the warm hat now because I'm sweating. And the light's really bad, so this one's got a peak on it obviously, which is going to cut the light when I put my glasses on so I can see better. What I'm doing, the main reason I've come to this piece of river is that it sort of offers me the two main areas the fish might be in these conditions. I've got a little bit of runny water, but it's not fast, hard water because we are in the middle of January and it's very cold. But it's got a nice little bit of pace to it. That runs out into a deeper, slightly slower bit of river. So what that means is that if the fish are preferring that slightly deeper, slower water, which they often do at this time of year, I can have a little test fish there. If they're in still the slightly faster moving water, I can fish that as well. So in one pass, really what I can do is work out what kind of water the fish are in. And basically I'm looking for grayling, normally speaking at this time of year, in that slightly more moderate pace of water. Now, it's not to say they won't be in very, very fast, shallow water. The one thing you cannot say in fly fishing is always and never. You know, the fish will go where the fish want to go for whatever the reason. So you can't rule anywhere out. Even at this time of year, I've seen them in really crazy, shallow, fast water. But on the balance of probabilities, they should be somewhere in this kind of water. Now what I am doing is I'm rigging this little chest box with a selection of patterns which I think I might need. So how I organise these boxes when I start to fish is I'll put a cross section of what I might need in, which in this cold weather stops me from going in and out of my fly box in my waistcoat. So at the minute I've selected some of the jig back caddis because I may want to slow those flies down and really tick the bottom, because at this time of year, believe it or not, the fish sometimes prefer flies which are travelling slower than the drift of the water or the flow of the water. So slowing the fly right down can be a deciding factor. I'm putting a few lighter beadhead patterns for the droppers. The Dark Night, the little CDC hackled bead heads that I do, and also some of the quills. And then I've also got a few chenille worm patterns, both in hot pink and the light baby pink, which in cold weather are an absolute killer pattern. They're an absolute killer pattern any time of year, to be honest. And often, especially in very clear water, I will fish that bright worm pattern on the top dropper, because what that does, it makes the fish look. If they see it coming down, it may well make them move, and quite often they'll come to the middle dropper or they'll come straight through and they'll take the worm off the top position. I'll also drop in an odd little egg fly as well. Again, always a very good pattern at this time of year. A couple of pink ones of those. And then with that relatively small section or selection of flies, I'll have a reasonable chance, hopefully, finding a few fish. Now, the methods. And again, remember, there's no always and never in this kind of fishing. I'm going to set up a nymphing rod, which is going to be a 3-fly nymphing rod, on a thin Euro leader, not as thin as I would fish in the summer, because this time of year, fishing heavy, I'm going to probably come into contact with the bottom a lot. So what I don't want to be doing is breaking the cast all the time. So I'll fish slightly heavier tippet material than normal, and I'll fish a slightly heavier main leader. It'll all be bicolour, so that I can see the colour change, and that allows me to judge the depth in the water column when I'm fishing the flies. So I'll know roughly what kind of depth of water I'm fishing to, and with the leaders having a colour break in them, i.e. being multicoloured, when I'm looking for a take, I'm indicating off a colour change. So I'm not looking at a single piece of line that's the same colour, I'm looking where the line changes colour, because that's a very good visual indicator of a take. So that's rod 1, 3-fly cast. It's going to have a heavy bomb fly on somewhere on the cast to slow everything down and get it deep. The second rod is actually a normal, if you like, 9-foot rod. This is a 5 weight versus my nymphing rod, which is a 10.5 foot 3 weight. This 9-foot 5 weight I'm going to use because this is really going to be the method that I use to try and search fish. So when we're fishing in these relatively big rivers, quite a lot of time we've got to find shoaled up grayling that are all nested in really tight. So I'm going to use an indicator setup, which is just basically a foam bung, which is going to be on the top dropper, and I'm going to have 2 flies below it. And that's effectively going to let me float fish or indicate a fish a long strip of water with slightly lighter flies to search and find where the fish may be sitting. Once I find them, I can then switch to the nymph rod, which is often a faster way to catch them. So that's a very good searching method if you don't know where the fish are going to be sat. The reason I'm doing it on a 9-foot for a 5 is because even at this time of year, there's always a very slim chance that we'll get a little bit of midge activity, or maybe even an odd olive or two, because it does happen even in the winter. You get a few large dark olives coming off. If you do, happy days, put your dry fly leader on, you get a chance on the dry fly. In all honesty, I don't expect it to happen, but there's a chance, so we've got it just in case. So I'll set these 2 rods up and then we'll do a little bit of fishing. So when I rig my fly lines and my leaders, what I do is, if there's a welded loop on the end of the fly line, I cut it off. And most of the lines I use have a braided core, and I actually weld in a tiny, tiny little 1mm micro ring, and it's a true 1mm. And that basically allows me to change these leaders multiple times if I need to, and it creates an incredibly small, incredibly neat joint that easily goes through the rod guides. And all of these little things really do make a big, big difference when you're fishing, to how efficient you are and to how many fish you actually land. There's nothing worse than having a clunky connection banging through the joints of the rod, the rings, when you're playing a good fish. That in itself can shake the fish off and drop the hook out of it. Okay, so my leader setup here is basically about a 1.5 rod length of bicoloured mono. It's actually tricoloured mono this, but it doesn't make a lot of difference, as long as it's not all the same colour. Or if it is all the same colour, you have a colour break in it somewhere. The tippet is 0.14 fluorocarbon. It's not particularly heavy. Heavier than I would typically use in the summer, but at this time of year in the winter, I'm not too worried about that. I'd rather have a little margin of error for coming into contact with the bottom of the river. And I'm going to put my flies on about competition regulation distance apart, which is 50 centimetres. I want to fish them close together because in all likelihood the fish are probably going to be down a little bit, and what I don't want to be doing is fishing the flies very, very widely spaced. I want to use the weight of the flies on the cast to get everything down into where I'm sort of expecting the fish to be honest. And occasionally With grayling obviously being a shoal fish, what happens is when you find one, you find several. And sometimes when you find several, you do actually catch them 2 at a time. Which it's debatable whether catching 2 at once, with the ensuing tangle that often happens, is a good thing or not. So we'll just knock the droppers on. Now, what I'll do before I put the flies on is, although this line is, as I mentioned, tri-coloured and we can see it's quite bright, this very harsh light we get in the winter, what I'm going to do is actually boost the definition of that a little bit by the use of these. These are basically solidified acrylic paint pens. It's basically a paint in a pen format. What you can do is paint it on your leader, and it really just highlights the colour and makes it pop. You can get them in lots of colours, but I like fluorescent orange, black for contrasting flat light, white and pink. And in this case I'm just going to use a bit of black, a bit of orange, and it sort of lifts up that overall contrast of my indicator. Now, what I am going to do, I'm going to put the flies on to start off with until I sort of work out what's going on. I'm going to start with the heaviest fly on the point of my nymphing cast. So what that's going to do is give me real straight line contact through the flies. So when I put the flies in and I fish them back, I'm going to be tight to everything because the weight is on the point. Where you put the weight on your cast when you're nymphing is a subject of great debate. You always get people say, oh, it should be in the middle, it should be on the point. The real answer is it should be where the fish want it to be, because depending on how you're fishing and what the fish are actually doing dictates where you put the weight. So if I'm not sure and I want good contact, what I'll do is I'll put the weight on the point. The reason being, I can control where the flies are in the water column a little bit by the rod angle. So what I can do is, if I want to fish the dropper flies a little bit lower, I'll lower my rod angle and fish it closer to the water. If I want to fish them up in the column, I hold the leader and the sighter more vertically above the flies, so I can control where they are a little bit. If I'm fishing upstream, a lot of the time, I'll have the weight on the point. If I'm fishing downstream, I'll often put the weight on the middle or even on the top dropper, because what happens is I'm working downstream, the current is going to straighten the flies out below me and it's going to give me some contact, and that heavier fly on either the middle or the top dropper is going to pull me flies down in the water. So although the weight's in the middle or maybe on the top, it's still giving me some degree of straight line contact. So the answer is, there's no right answer all the time. It depends what the fish want. And I've got to start somewhere, so I'll start with it on the point. And that's that jig back caddis on. Middle dropper. Going to be something a little less frightening. It's going to be a small dark night. It's a nice drab little pattern with a little bit of sort of pearly green in the thorax, catch a lot of fish on it. Useful when the fish have had a little bit of pressure, which this is a very popular place to fish, so these fish see quite a few flies. And then on the top dropper, I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to put on one of the light pink chenille worms with a drop bead, just to draw a little bit of attention to the middle dropper, hopefully. Although I will no doubt pick an odd fish up on it. Now, you might notice back end of the reel, I've actually got a little homemade contraption here. I often use a rubber band, but obviously I like to complicate things sometimes, and I've knocked that up out of a bit of elasticated webbing. That's just a device to stop everything tangling around the reel. Like I say, you can do it with a band, It's just a good little tip to stop you getting these thin nymphing leaders tangled. So I'm going to set my other second rod up, and this is the rod I said I can maybe flick between dries and fishing the indicator or the bung or whatever you want to call it, or the float. It's all the same thing. Really, there's so many different ways you can set this up. There's some ways which are really, really effective, where you can use like a sliding indicator, and you know, you can use indicators that don't have a hook in them, or you can use flies which actually have a hook and are really nothing more than a float with a hook in them, let's be honest. But to be honest, what I tend to do is still fish within some of the confines of competition fishing. Now, at world level, we can't use these kind of indicators anymore. We have to use like a dressed fly, something that the fish can eat. We can't use indicators with foam in them. But at the home international level, a lot of people still fish with this kind of indicator with a hook in it. And that's what I'm going to use today. And all I'm going to do is set a 3-fly cast up. This is going to be on the top dropper. But I'll show you a little trick that allows me to change the depth if I want to. And then below that I'm going to have 2 flies, again quite tightly spaced. They're not going to be too far apart, because I want to get the flies down in the water column. So with this method, what it's allowing me to do is fish lighter flies, but because I'm going to throw them further, I'm going to cast upstream with some fly line. It gives me a much longer drift window than it does with an nymphing rod. So that means I don't need to rely on pure fly weight to get the flies down. So my flies are actually going to drift a lot more naturally because they're not as heavy. So I'm using distance of cast to get down in the water column and let them trundle around. And what that means as well is that hopefully I should have far fewer snags on the bottom, because I'm fishing a lighter fly that rides better in the current. And as I mentioned before, with that indicator method, because I'm throwing some line and letting it drift over a much longer drift window, it's going to help me hopefully to find the fish. When I find them, I can get in then and fish with the nymphs a little bit more effectively around them. I'll tip it. Again, quite light on this. This is a little bit of 14. Now on this particular rig, it's quite simple what I've done actually. I've got a bit of heavy butt section with a single tippet ring in. What you can do is tie a bit of heavy butt section, and you can put 2 or 3 tippet rings in it. And then if you have your indicator, or your bung, or whatever you want to call it, tied to a section of nylon, you can literally just move that up and down the rings to alter your depth without changing the cast or the length of your tippet between your flies. Now, obviously, you can put a sliding indicator on if you want, but like I mentioned, I like to have something with a hook in, even if it's just to give me the illusion that I'm fly fishing and not float fishing. So I'm going to put that on the tippet ring. Don't make that dropper too long, because the longer the dropper, the more delayed the indication is if a fish takes that fly. So I want that on a nice short couple of inch dropper at the very most. So there we go. Okay, so fly wise on my indicator rig, what I've done, on the point I've gone for an egg fly. It's actually one of the small stillwater eggs, but they work very well in the river and you catch a lot of grayling with them as well. Now, one quick thing on egg flies. Yes, grayling do predate on eggs that are coming down in the drift. If you fish a river that has migratory fish, when you're grayling fishing, stay away from any fish that are spawning. There's 2 good reasons. Number one, it's just a complete jerk of a trick to fish too close to migratory fish when they're spawning. The second thing is, typically, the grayling are not there. They're not right on top of spawning fish. They're usually a good way downstream of them. The reason being, if you get salmon spawning, they're usually quite aggressive. So the grayling, when they push up to try and get close to the fish that are in the act of actually dropping eggs, usually get chased. So what they typically do, particularly the big fish, is they go and sit well downstream of them, waiting for stuff to come down to them. So stay away if you see migratory fish spawning. On the dropper above that, I'm going to have a little more normal nymph pattern, something a little bit drabber, just hedging my bets, and hopefully one of them will get me a little bit of action. Now, one last little tip with the indicator rig, absolutely crucial, is to grease up the leader behind the indicator. So this bit here that goes up to the butt section, that goes up to the end of the fly line, and the fly line, get some grease on it. The reason being, that floats on the surface, that indicator goes under, you've got a much cleaner set when you set the hook. So everything comes off nice and fast, the line's not sunk down in the water, you don't have to strike through it all. So there we go. A really basic indicator rig, nothing too fancy. We're going to get in, we're going to have a little prospect with the indicator rig. If we get a fish on it, great. If we don't, we're going to switch to the nymphs. If I find them with this, I'll probably switch to the nymphs anyway because it's usually a little bit more effective. So we'll get in and we'll give it a go. So what I'm going to do, I've waded out here. I've waded here for a reason. I'm in the slightly slower water and I can see, because the water's clear, there's a bit of a gravel edge dropping off into slightly deeper water. So what I'm going to do, bung rig first of all, I'm just going to run a few through and see if I can find a fish. So I'll throw it upstream and immediately I start controlling the line. So what I'm doing is mending behind the indicator to maintain some drag-free drift. Doesn't matter particularly if I move the indicator a little bit every so often, because if I pull the flies, it's actually giving them a little bit of additional movement, which the fish at times find really, really irresistible. And what I can do with this rig as well, when it comes below me, is feed line and just basically let it run down or trot down almost like a float, looking for a fish. Little false indication there off the bottom. Back in for another cast. Again, letting it run down. That was the bottom. Back in. There's a really good adage in nymph fishing, and it doesn't matter whether you're nymph fishing, bug fishing, Euro nymphing, any kind of nymphing you can think of. Always try and find an excuse to strike every single drift. The number of takes that you get when you're fishing with any kind of nymphing method that you actually see is a tiny percentage of the number of times a fish actually takes your fly in its mouth. Doesn't matter how good your contact is, doesn't matter how good an angler you are, there are a huge amount of takes you will never see. Most fish are expert at intercepting and then rejecting a fly without ever moving the indicator or ever feeling it at your hand. So always find a reason to strike, even if it's right at the very end of the cast. When you let everything come tight, set the hook, just in case, and back in again. Take a little move. Again, just letting that run down. And you can see with this really fairly, hate to say it, but agricultural kind of method, you can cover a lot of water. And in the winter, when we've got short days, particularly if you're fishing a big sort of spate river like this, finding them fish is really important. You might only have a few good hours of fishing in the day, so anything you can do to make it a little bit easier to track them down is useful. No, I'm going to give this a few more casts before we go on to the nymphing rig and see whether the fish are there, but they want it a little bit deeper, a little bit slower. Let's have a look. I would really hope to get an offer in the next couple of casts, if I'm being honest. A bit further this time. controlling that. And that's why that greasing of the line and the leader behind the indicator is so important. Because when I'm mending line, I'm controlling everything. It's so much easier if everything's floating. And in turbulent water or broken water, even good quality floating lines will sink. You'll push them under, so keep them greased. It's a good tip when you're dry fly fishing as well. Grease the back end of the fly line, grease the back end of the leader, and obviously don't grease the tippet. And that gives you good pickup when you strike a fish, and good control for mending when it's on the water. So I'm feeding line at the end of the drift there now, looking right down in that deeper, slower water. Just going to let it run this time in case they're right down there. I'll worry about striking if I get one. Right down. Going to let it come tight so it lifts in the water, which sometimes they really like. No, nothing there. Couple more chucks. And then it's probably going to be the bugs. Now when it comes to rods for doing this kind of fishing, in all honesty, if you are thinking about doing a little bit of grayling fishing, you've never done it before, and the kind of water you've got to fish on is this kind of big sort of spate river, and you think, you know what, the indicator or the bung is something I'm really familiar with on small still waters, and I want to try it for the grayling, do not be afraid of going out with your 10-foot 6 weight or your 10-foot 7 weight. You can get away with it. That could have been a fish. You can definitely get away with it, just to give you a go and a starter of trying to catch some grayling in the winter. Obviously, when you do a little bit more of it, you'll maybe want to look at a more specialised rod, something a little bit lighter, a little bit more all-round, like a 9.5 or a 9.5, 6 maybe, something like that. But don't be scared of trying it with your small still water gear. Nope. Right, the fisherman's old adage, one last cast, but I'm going to make it 2 last casts, because we always do that at least. And then I'm going to put the nymphs in here before I go too much further. I'm really in an area where I think they should be, and what I don't want to do is just fish on my merry way with nothing happening and leave them behind. Again, it's a good adage, and it's one I use a lot when I'm competition fishing. If nothing's happening, try and make something happen. Last cast. He says, trying to sound convincing, because it probably won't be the last one. There'll probably be at least 2 more before I give up. No, okay, right, last cast, this is it. Then the nymphs are going on. Longer one. Ooh, that could have been one. So, the last cast has now gone to 3 last casts, just in case I found the fish there. That definitely felt like a contact. Right, last cast, the nymphs are going on. Okay. Let's get that wound up. I think what actually happened then, when I struck, it's either the fish at the bottom, but it took that point fly. So I managed to get cracked off there. It's probably on the bottom. Never mind. We'll switch to the nymph rod. Now, what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to backtrack a little bit. So I am going to take the 2 or 3 steps that I took upstream. I'm going to back down and I'm going to re-fish through this little bit where the drop-off is, just in case those fish are sat hard on the bottom and they want a much slower presented fly. Because with that indicator rig, they're coming through a little higher in the water and a little bit at more natural drift speed. And what I want to do is fish through them a little bit slower. So, same thing when we're doing this kind of 3 fly heavy bugging. All of the stuff that's important with the kind of nymphing we do in the summer is still important here. So the first thing is good contact. Back end contact, keep everything tight at the back end. Line over your finger, keep the slack out of it, keep in contact with your flies. Track the flies down in the current. Let them get depth. Then you can walk them ever so slowly. Just lift the rod up and down and walk those flies a little bit. Now, one thing that you often hear a lot, any kind of nymphing, is, oh, it has to be dead drift. It has to be dead drift. They won't eat it unless it's dead drift. There's a fish. Now that one took when I was walking the fly a little bit. And that shows that dead drift is sometimes not always what they want. This little grayling, not a big fish. In fact, well below average for here. There we are. Little guy. And back to what we were talking about. So, drift. Everybody says, oh, you need a dead drift. That is not true. Grayling, especially when they're rising, if they're taking dries off the top, yes, can be absolutely very sensitive to drift, and you need a perfect drift sometimes to get them to even touch the fly. That's 100% accurate. But when you're nymph fishing, a dead drift is often not what you want. Grayling do seem to be very inquisitive. That's why all the very bright, wild coloured flies work really well. And it's actually the same with movement of the fly. So when that fly moves, they often really like to see that fly going up and down the water column. Now that's a stick fish. They like a dead drift particularly. Get rid of that one. Put it straight back in again. Now, you'll see some of my casts aren't going directly upstream. They're going more across, quartering on an angle. The reason being is because I've got that weighty point fly on. It's allowing me to control my flies a little bit better. So I'm not too worried about having what would traditionally be a poor angle to the flies. What I'm more concerned about is searching the water and trying to tempt a fish which might be quite inactive due to the low temperature by a combination of a little bit of movement. There's one. Think. Nope, another stick fish. Ooh, dear me. 2 stick fish and 1 grayling. Not good. But it shows we're in the right place. We've got the flies down. Nice and deep. A couple more chucks and then we're going to move. What I'm still doing at the minute is throwing quite a long line. And that's because I'm still in, let's call it the searching phase. I'm still looking to try and find a fish. That's the bottom. And that is one of the hazards of winter bugging, I'm afraid. You are going to stick bottom a lot. And that's where that slightly heavier line comes into its own. I've got all my 3 flies back. If I was fishing very light nylon, I would probably have lost those. Now another thing, when it comes to winter grayling fishing, in all honesty, grayling, generally speaking, certainly in this country and in some of the other countries where we fish, they are not particularly spooky. That's the bottom again. There must be a snag there. They're not particularly spooky. They will actually come in around you, even swim around your feet at times. So that you don't have to be too worried about spooking them with wading and ploughing around in the river. Might be looking at losing a fly there. Yeah. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to walk up above it a little bit, see if I can shake it loose. I never like leaving gear in the river if I can help it, although it's unavoidable sometimes. And again, I'll be honest, I'm not too worried about spooking the fish. Grayling on this river do tend not to be that concerned about the angler. And I've got my flies back, so that's good. A couple more drops in there, and then I might look to change flies a little bit. I'm not convinced there's more fish there. I think there should be. It's a perfect little place. They're either inactive or I've missed them. Let me have a little move around on fly pattern. Now, a couple more casts. See, I'm using the weight of the fly to lob that leader a long way. Really, when you're winter bugging, it is a case of throwing weight in a lot of cases rather than any form of precise casting. That was the bottom again. So we're getting down there. A good thing. Ooh, that might have been one. A little bit further over. I've got a feeling that these fish might be sitting a little bit further back. I've run into quite shallow water though without a fish. The only one I have had has been right back in here, and that's slower, deeper stuff. So I'm going to drop down a little bit into that, more that kind of water, and make sure I've not missed them. Now again, don't worry too much. Like I said, they sometimes like a slightly weird drift, so I'm letting that hook and swing now at the end of the cast. And I'm just slowly retrieving it back upstream, and animating the flies a little bit, just to see whether I can get one to give the rest of his mates away. Now quite often in the winter when we're looking for grayling, it is a case of find one, find a lot of them. Now, as it stands, I've managed to find Billy no mates, because there doesn't seem to be anything else sitting with that fish I've just caught. So, what I'm going to do now, once I've landed this fish, which feels heavier than the last one, to be honest, feels like a good fish, I might try some heavier flies, some different fly patterns in that area. That feels much bigger. I'm a little bit concerned that might not be a grayling. Oh no, it is. It's a good grayling as well. What's going on here? Oh, look at that. Okay, let's take our time a little bit with that. It's a nice fish. It's not a monster fish, but it's a good one. There he is. Look at that. That is a nice fish. Probably, I don't know, high 30s. You'll not be a 40cm fish, but certainly worth catching on a day like this. And he has taken the pink worm on the top dropper. So that fish is, in all likelihood, was lying quite deep and close to the bottom. And it's come a long way to take that pink fly that it's seen, even though it's got a tungsten bead on it and it's fished quite deep. It was on the top dropper. So all I've done is the middle fly, which was all dark, I've replaced it with a pink beaded perdigan. It's one of the full metal jacket ones. Small fly with a lot of weight in, but it's got a bit of pink and a little bit of flash. So it's a brighter, more obvious fly than the one I did have on in the middle dropper. And I'm just going to fish through where I caught that fish and see whether there's any more, which there should be, in all honesty. This time of year, especially when it's cold and you've got this really cold weather like we've had just recently, the fish can be slow to get going. You know, there's many times in the winter I've fished this river and many other rivers, and you know, you've fished a pool, you might have fished it twice, you might have fished it 3 times, and you've had nothing. It's like it's dead. And then all of a sudden they just switch on and they get going, and it's like they've appeared magically from nowhere, and you can get fish after fish after fish. So don't always write something off just because it's been slow going. I'm going to fish through there a little bit. And what I'm doing now, because I've had that fish, I've had that nice fish there, I'm reacting to absolutely everything that might be a fish, because in all honesty, the take was very soft. It wasn't a particularly aggressive take. It just went a little bit dead on me. It wasn't moving, drifting quite right. So like I say, you always look for an excuse to set the hook. You never know when it's a fish. A number of times I hear people say things like, well, I didn't strike because it was the bottom. Well, I have to say, they must be much better than me at this, because after 40 odd years, nearly 40 years of doing this, I can't tell the difference between the bottom and a fish. You know, if something affects the drift of that fly, you have to check it and see whether it's a fish. And what's that? I think that is another stickfish. So at the minute, we are 3 for 2. 3 stickfish, 2 grayling. Now, what I will do, manage to get myself in a mess, is just check the flies are all clean, there's nothing on them, because to quote a very good friend of mine, the late Oliver Edwards, trout don't like salad. So it's a good idea to, when you've had contact with anything, the bottom, is to make sure everything is still nice and clean. Right, we're back in. I'm going to walk them flies a little bit. Now, jigging the flies, could have been one, does not mean bouncing the rod tip up and down like your deep sea jigging. It means just imparting a little bit of movement to the flies with the rod tip. You don't have to do it overly aggressively. It's just something to make that fly just look a little bit alive, or just tempt them a little bit more. Right, there's a fish, same sort of place, really soft take again, really soft take, right off the edge of that current. Now with this rod you'll see it's actually bending a lot, even with not particularly big fish. That's because it's quite a through action rod, and it's the kind of rod I like for my winter grayling fishing. Reason being, I tend not to lose that many fish with it. You don't get very many hook pulls with a soft rod. And even relatively modest grayling like this one give a really good account of themselves on it. Now, there's another nice little fish. I'm slipping back, not even going to touch him. And interestingly, that took the pink worm again on the top dropper. So, there could be a few things going on. Might just be a pink worm kind of day. Fish could be more keen to eat something high in the water column, or it could just be coincidence. going to give it 2 more drifts through here, and then I am getting out of the river, because despite having base layers, thermal lined trousers, 2 pairs of socks, I am completely dead from the knees down and cannot feel anything. And as much as I like catching grayling, I don't particularly want to lose my feet to frostbite. So it's going to be 2 or 3 more runs through. The famous fly fisherman's last cast, which is obviously always about 7 or 8. Here we can find another one, and then we're going to have a little bit of a move and warm up. So the eagle-eyed of you might have noticed that occasionally when I'm bugging, I'm letting go of the line with my left hand, which is something normally, which I always say is a big no-no. Well, there's 2 reasons I'm doing that today. One, I can't feel my left hand, because it's been in the water a couple of times now unhooking fish, and my fingers have stopped working. The second thing is, to be honest, with this kind of fishing in the winter, when we're bugging deep and we're down on the riverbed, it's not as critical, because it's unlikely that I'm going to get an impact take when the flies land, because most of the fish are sitting deep down. So if I do let the line slip from my left hand, I'm not as worried about it, in all honesty. As I mentioned before, my last cast has turned into about 20. So I'm going to fish this little shallow bit out, and then I'm going to come out and we're going to have a walk. Right, we're going to call that a day for in there with stick fish number 7. Okay, so we've had a little walk downstream, caught a few fish here this morning. They were down there in that deeper, slower water, but the temperature's come up a little bit. The light's dropped a little bit because it's getting quite late in the day, and I've come back up into the head, into the slightly faster, a little bit shallower water, and I'm just going to have a little fish across. I've still got a pink worm on and a couple of beads, a couple of silver beaded nymphs, just to see whether those fish that were down there in that slower, deeper water have moved up a little bit into slightly shallower, slightly faster water, which is not totally unheard of at this time of year. Oh, that could have been a fish. A little rattle there. Just walking them flies through. A little jig as they come round. Oh. A little bit more line. I've got lighter flies on it. I haven't got the big jig back caddis on that I had because of that shallower water. I'm just fishing 3 normal sort of weighted flies, getting a nicer drift. Oh, that was a fish. I lost that one. It's unfortunate. That felt like a decent fish as well. So, I think there's a few there. Nope, not that time. There is just like a little bit of a softer spot over there, which I might just like sitting in. Oh, another one. That's 2 takes, which I haven't connected with. So what I'm going to do quickly, check the point of the fly. That one's good. That one's good. So it's not the hook point. Must be operator error. That's what that is. Got to be some more there. So I'll fish across a little bit more, see if there's actually another willing customer there. Could have been one, I don't think so. Just walking those flies through, just animating them a little bit, giving them a little bit of movement. Come round onto the swing. In there. There we go. There's a fish. Again, that's in that shallower water, really surprising. Wouldn't have thought they'd be that far up here in this weather, but they are. There's a nice grayling. Looks like it's on the pink worm again. Not a monster, but a nice fish, about the same stamp as we've been getting the rest of the day. On that pink worm, there he is. Nice little fish to round the day off. Been a tough day. We've probably had, I don't know, 7 or 8 grayling. A few nice little ones like that one. But all in all, what can you ask for a freezing cold day in the middle of January? It's better than sitting in the house.